Hi, everyone, and welcome to our keynote session with Carol Black. Carol, we're so delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And you've had a very busy day, and we appreciate your taking time to be with us. Thanks to our sponsors for the conference. And if you would let Carol know where you're participating from, I'm going to give you whiteboard permissions. Look for the star to the left of the map, and double-click on the star and click on the map. And you might also do a shout-out to let her know if you're somewhere that you are experiencing interesting time or weather conditions. It looks like the winner today or tonight is Morocco. If you're further from Carol, is in Colorado than Morocco, let us know. Otherwise, wherever you're participating from, or if you're listening to the recording, we sure appreciate your being here. Now we're going to do a little bit of magic. Go to the last slide. And turn it over to you, Carol.
Okay, great. You know, I was wondering to start with, let's see if I can figure out, if I can remember how to, no, I can't see it, how to do a poll.
I can do that for you.
Let's see. Okay, I think I got it. How many, did I get it? How many people have actually seen the film? Because I just, you know, this is not a test, but I don't want to repeat myself too much if most people have seen it.
So to indicate that you've seen the film, look for the fourth icon over in the participant window and click yes, or for if you've seen the film, or X no, that you haven't seen the film. So that's in the participant window. The fourth icon over is a yes-no checklist.
Okay, good. And let's see. And then how many people have seen the Ken Robinson RSA animate about changing education paradigms, and where he talks about the model of factory schooling?
I cleared the poll so you can answer again. Carol, the top graph.
Should I click on?
No, I did. I already cleared it. So the top graph
okay,
are the responses to your first question. It looks
okay,
like 7 indicated they had not, 4 indicated that they had. And we're going to now publish the poll for the Ken Robinson. And it looks like 5 have not, but 8 have.
Okay, good. What I wanted to talk about today is just, you know, when we think about traditional indigenous cultures, the sort of smaller cultures that are scattered around in the remote or rural parts of the world, and we think about global education, people are often sort of thinking on that kind of Greg Mortensen 3 cups of tea model, where the idea is that these people are deprived because they don't have schools, and in some cases they're not literate, and what they need is help from the developed world to build schools so they can educate their children. And you know, I just want to kind of push on that idea a little bit today, because I think, unfortunately, that it's a little bit of a holdover from some kind of colonial attitudes toward traditional cultures that we might need to sort of rethink in the modern moment. And there seems to be one slide which, oh, you know what, these are out of order.
Oh, they're not even in order? Hang on.
No, they're really out of order.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you how to do this very easily, and we can do it for you, but if you click on the white drop down, you can then choose them. I'm going to take you to slide 2 right now.
Okay.
And is that the next one you wanted?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we'll get a little creative with it.
Now, you just tell me when to go to the next slide, and I'll take you to the next one.
Oh, okay. Gosh. Well, you know, maybe if I can see the one I want, I'll just go for it. Anyway, so you know, there were all these recent revelations that Greg Mortensen had falsified a lot of the incidents in his book and had exaggerated the numbers of schools he had built, and also revelations that there was really no follow-up on these schools and what the impact they were having on the communities where they were built were. And I think that there's kind of a larger problem of what I would call fictional thinking in our discussion about schooling. And to me, one of the biggest single obstacles to the kind of real education reform that we need is the failure to distinguish between what we imagine is going to happen in a school and what really does happen there. People design programs and they have very grand mission statements about, what's going to be accomplished by this program, and there's always a minority of children who sort of play that out for us and make it look like it's working. But there are really, really large numbers of children who, very different things are happening for them. So if we look at, why is it that education is not reducing the numbers of people who are living in poverty, in the United States even, where we've had schools, we've had compulsory education for a very long time, and the gap between rich and poor is just getting bigger. And, the obvious answer is, it's the economy, stupid. But beyond that, I think the problem is that there are structural aspects to our education system which are working at cross purposes with what we think our goals for children are. And so one of the biggest things that we're not thinking about clearly is that every year what we do is we take millions of really normal, healthy children, and we wind up labeling them as failures in ways that damage their life opportunities, damage their psyches, damage their entire future. We really got to ask ourselves, why are we doing that to kids? Because everybody knows that a lot of the kids who get labeled in this way are very bright children. They may be too rebellious, they may be too creative, they may be too sociable and just, like to talk and laugh and run around too much. They may be too physically energetic. There are all kinds of really good, healthy traits that children can have that wind up causing them to fail within the school system. And I really think we're not confronting that head on. So, but when you look at traditional cultures around the world, the idea that Greg Mortensen and people like him are pitching is that these people are very, very poor. And what they need is education so that they can escape poverty. So I want to kind of push on that idea a little bit too. When you talk about poverty, and we interviewed head of the South Asia program at the World Bank for Schooling the World, and we talked about this idea of defining poverty as life on less than $2 a day. So if you go to a place like Ladakh, where we shot Schooling the World, and you go into these beautiful jewel-like valleys where people raise abundant crops of barley and potatoes and vegetables of all kinds in the summer, and they have livestock and they have milk and butter and meat, that take them through the winter. You can live a pretty decent life without cash. So when you talk about poverty, when you talk about living on $2 a day, you've got to ask yourself, what are the other factors? And we talked to the World Bank guy and sort of said, well, how do you account for the cash value of having grandparents to provide child care rather than having to pay for child? There is no cash value ascribed to things like that. There's no cash value ascribed to beauty. There's no cash value ascribed to, community and emotional support. So when we're moving kids from traditional subsistence cultures, and subsistence seems like this very grim word that makes it sound as though people are barely surviving, but But what subsistence really means is that people are providing for themselves quite independently. They're living off the land and providing for their needs independently. So when we build schools and transition kids from that kind of economy where nobody's getting rich but nobody is starving into the modern economy, what you're going to find is that there are a certain small percentage of kids whose lives are going to get, quote unquote, better, and there are a lot of people whose lives are going to get worse. So life on $2 a day in the modern economy is a whole different picture than life on $2 a day in a valley in Ladakh or in the highlands of Papua New Guinea or in the rainforest of the Amazon or Orissa in India. So when you hear the talk about education and poverty and education raising GDP or education raising family income, you really have to ask a lot of questions before you accept that as being something that demonstrates that the quality of life has actually improved. Let's see.
Carol, I think I'm getting these in order for you, so you should just be able to left-click and go through them in order now.
Oh, okay, good. So just quickly, if you just look at some of the basic measures of societal well-being, and there's a new book out called The Spirit Level that actually says the key measure of societal well-being is the level of equality in a society. Once people have, a roof over their heads and enough to eat, all kinds of things are better in relatively egalitarian societies. And once you have very unequal societies, all kinds of social and physical pathologies go up. Crime, violence, mental illness, substance abuse, all kinds of things get worse when you have major inequality. So, in the traditional economy, things are relatively egalitarian. There may be some hierarchy, but it's limited compared to what we have, which is just vast extremes of wealth and poverty in the modern global economy. People are relatively independent. They have self-sufficient livelihoods. They provide for almost all of their needs themselves, and so they aren't vulnerable to these massive global economic swings that cause sudden dislocation, unemployment, major problems in the modern economy. There's a lot of talk about, education somehow, enabling people to participate in democracy. In, these small remote communities, there's usually a village council or a tribal council. I have to say as a caveat, every culture is different. There are many, many different kinds of cultures, and, some you'd probably more want to join up with than others. People are people, and there are problems all over the place. But in, a lot of remote cultures, the individual has some voice in community decisions, and even in cultures that are sort of traditionally I don't want to say male-dominated, but where the males ostensibly have the role in the village council. If you really get to know people or talk to them, you'll often find that women are very influential, but just through different channels. In the mass modern economy, individuals feel really very powerless, and you see our Occupy Wall Street movement now, where people are just trying to get some voice again. In traditional economies, there are generally strong family and community safety nets. Helena Norberg-Hodge, who's in Schooling the World, has started a project where she brings Ladakhi sort of women leaders to London or some other city in the developed world. And one of the things that they are most shocked by is homelessness and nursing homes. They can't understand why someone would live on the street. Why don't they just go home to their family? And, in terms of nursing homes, they can't understand why the elderly aren't living with their families. In the modern economy, particularly in a lot of developing nations, social safety nets are very weak or absent. And, in India, for example, you just see people, anyway, everybody knows that. An interesting thing that, and this is not about education, but I'm kind of pressing on this because it's this idea of these poor, impoverished people that makes everyone think that it's a virtue to bring our school system to these other cultures. Bill Clinton and the United Nations, very mainstream organizations, are now kind of coming out and saying that ecological agriculture for local consumption is really the key to food security. The big initiatives through the 90s and the early part of the 2000s to create incentives for people to grow crops for export rather than just growing on small farms for local consumption have really backfired. And so when Haiti had its earthquake, Bill Clinton finally went before a panel and just said, look, we made a mistake. People are really vulnerable to, they're vulnerable to speculation, price manipulation, all kinds of things can result both in farmers going broke because prices are manipulated and they don't get the prices for their crops that they had hoped to get, and also consumers are going hungry around the world because Wall Street is speculating on agricultural land and food commodities and driving up food prices, and people are literally people are starving, and they're going to continue to starve because this speculation is a major problem that is resulting in massive manipulations of food prices. So when people are living like they are in a valley in Ladakh and they're raising their own food and they really have everything they need, that is a much better path to food security than to get educated for a job in the modern economy and try to make money that way. So health, now here's something you hear a lot about with traditional cultures. You'll hear about, oh, it's very terrible because they have high rates of infant mortality and, infectious disease. But once people are transitioned from these traditional societies into the modern economy, they have higher rates of diabetes, cancer, heart disease, addiction, violence, suicide, really thorny, difficult pathologies that are not easily cured, whereas the child mortality that you have in traditional regions is actually quite easily dealt with. And, it doesn't take 12 years of education, it takes antibiotics. And of course, the bottom line is that traditional economies are sustainable and our economy is unsustainable. So when you build schools and you tell people that they're going to have this great life if they just go to school, of course, one of the immediate things that happens is that there aren't enough jobs, even for those who do graduate. So you have a high school failure rate, and again, in traditional parts of the world, there's a mistake in our thinking because people from the West come from middle-class neighborhoods with well-funded schools that have, 90%, or nearly 100% graduation rate and, 85% college attendance rate. That's not what they're going to get when you build a school in a little remote area in another part of the world. They're going to get schools that have failure rates of 50 to 90% in most places. Very, very high failure rates. And then the kids who fail are really ill-equipped to deal with life, but even the ones who graduate, there aren't enough jobs. And they say in Pakistan, where Greg Mortensen was working, there's people with MBAs that are walking the streets and there's no jobs for them. So again, we're building schools thinking that somehow we're going to bring this rosy existence to people, but it's really not that simple. I'm going to go past my Ken Robinson slide, although if you haven't seen this RSA animate of the Changing Education Paradigms by Ken Robinson, give it a look because it's really brilliant and it really sort of dovetails with the message of schooling the world. It's kind of about connecting the dots, what I'm trying to do here. The other justification for building schools is often has to do with women and girls, and that we need to build schools to equalize relationships between men and women in other cultures. And I'm not saying that there's no validity to this. I'm not saying that there aren't people who have benefited by that, but I do think it's important to realize that not all women from traditional cultures are some kind of exploited victims. Many of them have, self-respect and a good quality of life. All cultures are different, and not all cultures, just because they're traditional, exploit women. Even like my grandparents lived in a era where women didn't have equal rights to men, but my grandmother was a strong and self-respecting woman, and she had a loving and mutually respectful relationship with my grandfather. If somebody had come in from another country and tried to alter their relationship, you know, I'm not sure it would have had a good outcome. So people are entitled to work through their own issues at their own pace and in their own way. And again, I'm not saying there aren't any places where, you know, women want educational assistance and they may want outside assistance in dealing with inequalities that they have in their societies. I'm not saying that never happens, but we shouldn't assume that it's happening everywhere. And a really interesting thing about what happens when you take a girl from a traditional agricultural society, like, you know, the picture that you see here, and you tell her, as Greg Mortensen, you know, says in 3 Cups of Tea, that he told the kids to dream big. Well, you know, what is it that happens when those dreams aren't fulfilled? Because there aren't enough jobs, there aren't enough, you know, sort of wonderful careers for everybody. And, you know, Greg likes to tell the story of the girl from the traditional village who, you know, passes her exams and becomes a doctor and comes back to the village and reduces infant mortality. But he's not telling us what's happening to all the other girls. And I was talking recently to a woman I know who was born in the Philippines, and she actually took advantage of a U.S. Army training program in the Philippines that allowed her to train as a nurse. She came to the U.S. and works as a nurse. And she heard me talking about schooling the world, and she, like, perked up and got very interested and started asking questions about it. And so I was talking to her, and she comes from a village, you know, rural hill agricultural village in the northern Philippines. And you know, I said, well, what is it like there? Are people living just a grinding, miserable existence? And she said, no, it's, you know, it's nice. I mean, you know, we don't have a lot, but, you know, everybody eats, and we hang out in the evenings, and we talk and sing and spend time together, and it's not so bad. And I said, well, what is it that happens to girls from your village who go to school but then don't do well in school? And just without missing a beat, she said, they get trafficked. And so a really interesting thing is that people assume that a lack of education is the thing that puts girls and women at the risk of human trafficking. And this is trafficking for sex. It's trafficking for domestic servitude. There are a lot of women around the world, all over the world, living in slavery, essentially in, you know, working as housekeepers and nannies, and trafficking for sweatshop labor. And increased risk of human trafficking actually correlates with more years of schooling and the ambition that that creates to migrate to an urban area in search of some sort of quote-unquote better life. When that better life doesn't materialize, then girls are very vulnerable to the predatory, you know, forays of traffickers. And, you know, there's very well-oiled international organizations in human trafficking. It's big, big business, you know. And so girls become very vulnerable because they've been led to believe that there's something more out there for them, and then that doesn't actually materialize. So when kids from these remote parts of the world are sort of transitioned into these urban areas, you have to remember, again, you're coming from your middle class neighborhood thinking that you're going to build a school for somebody and it's going to give them a middle class life. I guess that's what people are thinking. But, you know, if you look at the numbers of urban poor around the world, you have to realize that the chances of that are actually not good for most of these kids. And so when you transition kids from traditional cultures into the lower echelons of the economies in these urban areas, there are all kinds of pathologies that increase. And so depression and mental illness, you know, drug and alcohol abuse, malnutrition in a lot of cases, because the diet in a lot of rural places is actually quite healthy. And then when people are transitioned into urban poverty, you know, they're eating very poor quality processed foods and lots of starches, and actually their nutritional status is going down. although in many cases you do have obesity and diabetes. And the family disruption results in higher rates of domestic violence, and a really striking thing for kids from traditional cultures around the world is very high suicide rates. And so even in kids that are still living in their traditional places, their life has been so disrupted. And school is a big, big part of this disruption of the traditional way of life. It's a big change. And these kids go to school. A high percentage of them don't mesh with it. They fail. They're labeled as failures, and they have really high suicide rates. Among the developing parts of the world that, have had over the past, 10 or 15 years, these booming economies, what you have is extraordinarily high rates of pressure put on kids. And so in India and China and Korea, the suicide rate among girls is now higher than the rate among boys. The suicide rate is high among girls and boys, but typically it's been, higher among boys. But in these nations, the rate is now higher among girls, and a leading cause is academic pressure. In India, girls are drinking insecticide to kill themselves. They're hanging themselves, and there have been a couple of cases of girls who have immolated themselves. They're setting themselves on fire. So these are some really unhappy kids. So again, you hold up this idea that this girl is going to go to school and become a doctor. Well, you got to think about what happens if it doesn't work out that way for her. So as we talk about global education, and we talk about the idea of sort of educating the whole world, I think what we have to think about is that we are, in general, coming at that with a highly ethnocentric point of view. As Wade Davis says in the film, everybody educates their children. People everywhere educate. There are no uneducated children. People everywhere educate their children. It's just that they have different ideas of what education is. They have different ideas of what is important to learn, and they have different ideas of how people should learn it. What are the best ways for adults to relate to children to enable them to learn the things that they need to know. And so one of the things that really terrifies me is any talk of this idea of global standards for education. Because, the question just arises, well, who gets to decide what these standards are? I mean, right now there are parents and teachers everywhere who don't like the standards in the U.S., and they feel very powerless to do anything about it. So if we have global standards for education, that is going to be a kind of authoritarian thing that wipes out diversity in a really scary way. So the point here is learning is a human universal. Schooling is not. Schooling is a fairly recent cultural phenomenon. And this is where I'm going to go back to this slide, which I think should go here, because Ken Robinson's talk about this, that schooling as we know it arises historically during the early industrial period. So people really thought differently about a lot of things at that time than we do now. People were thinking about children as being sort of raw materials that were going to be fed into, onto this conveyor belt, into this factory, and they were going to be sort of processed in a certain way, and then they were going to come out in a certain way. And they had a very mechanical view about how this was going to be accomplished. And, children stubbornly refuse to be processed in the ways that we think that they should be processed. I mean, I sort of say it's like a horse under saddle finds 1,000 methods of resistance to fight back, to forget, to not pay attention, to rebel, in all kinds of ways. Kids won't do what we think that what the adults have decided that they should do. They do something quite different in many cases. So kids put up a pretty good resistance to this factory model. Some kids allow themselves to be put on the conveyor belt, and they will, provide the adults with, what the adults want them to do, and they will kind of dutifully do this. But we really have to ask ourselves if that's what we want to be doing to children, because the most brilliant people will not do it. The most creative people will not do it. And so, we put quotes in Schooling the World from, Einstein and Tolstoy and Tagore, and, the most brilliant people will usually resist this form of processing. They'll resist this form of control because, they have their own interests, they know what they want to do, and they're usually smarter than the teacher. And so kids like that are difficult to control. And, a lot of other kids are too. So we sort of persist in this factory model, even though most teachers don't really view children that way, and that's not what they want for children, and they don't want to be sorting kids into successes and failures. They don't want to be labeling kids. They want to do wonderful creative things with their kids, but the structure that we're living with essentially prevents that. And so it's not a human universal. It's a recent cultural construct. So we need to look at the culture of schooling and decide whether we really want to have all these aspects to it that we do have. So these are just a few. You could list a lot more things that are very, if you look at school as an anthropologist, there are these very distinct features that it has. It has a heavy focus on competition and ranking. I mean, there's nothing about learning that requires it to be competitive. There is nothing about learning that requires that we rank children according to how well they've learned it. I mean, both my daughters are brilliant cooks, but they don't do it competitively. They often do it cooperatively. So the competition and ranking in schools is just a cultural feature that we've chosen. We don't need to choose that. The age segregation, dividing children up by ages, we don't need to do that. The separation from nature, the fact that most education takes place indoors, so children are now spending most of their lives indoors. The restriction on physical activity. Learning is controlled by distant experts. There is somebody in your state capital that's deciding what your kids have to learn, and you and your kids teachers do not have a lot to say about it. So if you and your kids teachers would like to do something different, but the state has dictated that, they've got to learn what's on the test, you have a problem. And then, other features like the fragmentation of knowledge into subjects and the separation of knowledge from ethical and spiritual concerns, which, of course, we have in this country for very good reasons because we don't want the schools to impose religion. But there are problems to taking that dimension out of the learning process. So competition, in many, many traditional societies, it is not considered polite or respectful to try to be better than other people. That is sort of the definition of kind of a buffoon, a boastful buffoon in a lot of societies. And anything that involves a public display of your own superiority is considered, rude and sort of contemptible. And, that kind of behavior is really frowned on, and yet school promotes it. So when you introduce schooling with grading and ranking, and all of a sudden one kid is the star student and another kid is the loser, that's a very disruptive thing, and it really interferes with people's traditional ways of relating to one another and maintaining social harmony in their communities. I would argue it interferes with our ability to maintain social harmony in our communities as well. In traditional cultures, children do a lot. Kids, in Ladakh, the grandparents take care of the little kids. They don't have to be in daycare because they're there with their grandpa or their grandma. It's really sweet. But kids in most traditional cultures spend a lot of time just running around pretty freely in groups of multi-age children. And so anyone who has kids knows there's that natural tendency for a younger kid to to want to learn from an older kid. They just admire the kid in the sort of next age group up from them. That's the one where they can see what it is. You know, I can feel it. I can almost reach it. I'm almost there. That's how I want to be. Whereas when they're relating to an adult, you know, it's a very different relationship. So modern schools are cutting off this avenue for learning by segregating children by age. Children traditionally spend most of their time outdoors. There's a really cool movie called Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, where these Inuit elders are saying how their education was they would get up in the morning and their parents would say, go outside. And they would just watch, you know, they would watch the clouds and the birds and the wind and the weather patterns and the movements of animals and the growth of plants, and they just developed this, you know, detailed understanding of their ecosystem that seems almost, you know, superhuman to us. Well, modern schooling quickly results in the loss of that kind of knowledge. You can't get that kind of knowledge without just putting the hours in observing nature. The restrictions on physical activities, you know, in traditional cultures, kids are usually physically active in work and play, and so adapting to a sedentary existence is a really new thing. And then for the community, the whole idea that everything is now controlled by these distant experts and that there's no longer this local autonomy, there's no longer respect for local elders and local knowledge, those are all now seen as inferior. And so you have kids taking a whole different attitude toward their parents and their grandparents. They become very disrespectful in a lot of cases, and they now think that they know it all, and they lose any respect for the knowledge of their elders. So again, this is really a big change. So I think what we need to do is just really look at, you know, what I call the missionary fallacy. We've created this structure of schooling. At home, we're having very active debates about, you know, which aspects of it are actually a good idea, and yet we're promoting it as though everyone in the world should do it. And so this is kind of an important distinction because, you know, there's nothing wrong with being a Christian, but I have a big problem with the idea that everybody has to be a Christian. So I have no problem if people want to build schools and send their kids to schools, and I have no problem if people from Nepal or Ladakh want to have a school. What I have a problem with is the idea that everybody in the world has to go to school, and that this is really the only way to arrange human learning. It's the only way to arrange our communities, and everybody should do it. And so I was going to try. How many people have seen this? I don't.
You can click on
anyway,
the check mark green yes if you've seen it, the X if not, and I can bring it up in a web tour if you'd like me to bring that video up.
Sure. I mean, I think I was actually able to do it, but maybe you should do it. So yeah,
I'm finding the link.
Just a little. Yeah, well, the link is right there below it. Can you copy and paste off of there or no?
Unfortunately, no, but I think I've got it here.
Yeah.
So tell me when you want to do it if you'd like to do it.
Let's do it. Everybody, it's just a short little test. Just try and do your best.
It will start playing, and just let it play through.
Disregard. Oops.
How many passes did you count? The correct answer, 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Let's see, somebody put the link on there to the sequel. Should we do the sequel, you guys? So how many people saw the gorilla in this group? Wow, we have a good group. Apparently 50 to 80% of people don't see it when they're focusing on counting the basketball passes, and I'm told that people who are good students are less likely to see it. So there is actually a sequel for people who have. Yeah, you want to do the sequel?
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
So I'm going to have to speed it up here if we're going to have any time for questions. But anyway, I was just going to say that I think that we've got some invisible gorillas in our school system, in our thinking about schooling. So one, I think, is the creation of millions of failures. Two, the destruction of other very valid forms of intelligence, because what we're doing is we're counting basketballs and we're not seeing the gorilla. There really are many different ways for the human mind to function. And, you know, a third is really the unsustainability of our linked economic and educational systems, which, as I said, are very hierarchical. They're creating vast discrepancies of wealth and poverty. And I'm way behind here. So, you know, the big question that I usually get is, isn't this all inevitable? Don't children have to adapt to the global economy? And, you know, what I would just like to point out is that at every period of history, certain things really seem inevitable. Whatever the dominant system of your time is seems inevitable. So here's our picture of American progress drifting across the plains, and the Indians and the wild animals are, you know, running away from her, and, you know, progress is coming, you know, behind, and she's holding a school book in her hand. And here's Uncle Sam, you know, teaching Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines so that they can become civilized and educated like all the other good students. So, you know, whatever it is that's going on in your cultural time, there's a tendency not to see past it. But I really think that potentially we're living at the beginning of an era of great creativity and collaboration and learning. I think this hierarchical factory model of schooling is really an early 20th century thing, and it is on its way out with the information age. And we have I'm just going to go past these to the next slides because we don't have a lot of time. There are a lot of new organizational models that are afoot, and the organizational models that have created the amazing technological breakthroughs that we've witnessed in the last 20th century are networked, collaborative, they're feedback loop, reinforcing, kind of egalitarian models. The Amazon model there is kind of the top-down model. That's our school system now, where teachers and students are just puppets of decisions that are being made at the top. And teachers and students just need to stop putting up with that and start getting into the ability to really collaborate with each other with greater freedom and autonomy. A lot of you may have seen the hole-in-the-wall experiments that Sugata Mitra did with putting computer screens into a wall in India, where street children, illiterate street children, quickly learned to teach themselves how to use the computer. And this is not one of those let's have computers instead of teachers things, but the interesting thing about these experiments is watching how the kids teach each other. So he has a TED Talk on that, and give it a look because it's really inspiring in terms of how kids can collaborate with each other, and again, multi-age groups of kids, to really learn a lot. There's a great program called Manzil in New Delhi, which is a voluntary drop-in learning center for low-income kids. And they're providing really great resources. They're just experimenting. They're finding their way, but they're taking these great field trips, and they have arts programs, and they've got a band, and they do plays, and they have math classes, and it's all voluntary, though, and the kids teach each other, and it's not a hierarchical thing. There's the fabulous Thompson School District Innovation Lab in Loveland, Colorado, and Monica Hardy, who I think is here, is going to do a session about that tomorrow. You should really try to see it because they're doing some amazing experiments there with that project. And the one other thing that it's important to remember is that people don't have to modernize if they don't want to. There's a movement in Vanuatu called the custom movement, where people are choosing. We talked to this woman. She spoke English and French. She had been educated in New Zealand, and she was living in this village that's pictured here. And they pick up a little cash giving tours, but they really are living this way. They're living in their traditional way. They're just like, hey, we have mangoes, we have coconuts, we have fish, we have pigs and chickens. What do we need with, low-wage labor? So, and then as far as brain research that's coming out, here's another. I'm just giving you lots of homework in this talk, but there's a really good talk about the divided brain, which is another one of the RSA animates, and you should give it a look if you can, because what they're discovering, and the old model of the left and right brain is kind of gone by the wayside, I guess, but what they're discovering is that there still is this persistent difference between the two hemispheres of the brain. And the left hemisphere is very sharp focus, attention narrows, you're counting the basketballs. It's kind of abstracted and mechanical. It has clarity and power to manipulate known fixed static objects. The right brain has a soft focus, which is what hunters use. People who are hunter-gatherers use this kind of soft focus with a widened peripheral vision, a kind of panoramic view, which picks up any little nuanced change in the overall kind of holistic context. So knowledge is embodied and contextual, and it gives more power to understand individual, contextualized, living, changing beings. So, one side counts the basketballs, one side sees the gorilla, one side sees the trees, one side sees the forest, and this talk is arguing that our education system and our modernized cultures have become extremely unbalanced in favor of the left, whereas you will find that traditional cultures are much more, balanced. I don't necessarily know that traditional cultures are unbalanced toward the right, but they have a lot more emphasis on the right. So, you know, what you have is these things that traditional people know that seem almost superhuman to us. In New Guinea, the average person can identify 70 species of birds by their songs. In the Arctic, the older people can perceive amazing, you know, changes in, you know, weather, you know, bird and animal behavior. In Polynesia, traditional navigators can detect an island that's miles away out of sight by just subtle changes in wave patterns and bird behavior. And in the Amazon, shamans can identify hundreds of medicinal plants, and they know how to combine plants so that, you know, scientists have discovered that the chemicals in these plants are actually potentiating each other in certain ways to create different effects. And these shamans know how to combine these things. But if you ask them, how do you know, how to identify this plant, they'll say, we know them by their songs. So there are a lot of mental capacities out there in the world that are not being recognized by our school system. We think that we have some kind of a balanced curriculum. I think we're using a very small part of our brains, and we're insisting that everybody on the planet use the same part. And I think that that is a big, big mistake. So as we think about global learning, as we think about I've lost my notes here. As we think about global competence and global dialogue, I think we need to go a lot farther and deeper in looking beyond these narrow cultural blinders that we have. We need to have a much deeper respect for other cultures and other ways of knowing things. We need to go to shift from a model of a single form of intelligence in which there's sort of this hierarchy of smarter and dumber people into a vision of multiple intelligences that is far more radical than anything that we've been talking about. And we need to stop measuring intelligence and start creating the conditions for intelligence which is immeasurable. We need to stop controlling teachers and students like puppets in a hierarchical system, and we need to start creating the freedom for teachers and students to network with one another in complex, flexible, branching, intersecting, endlessly creative ways. The great evolutionary success of our species is that we are all different. We are all good at different things. Some of us, count the basketballs. Some of us see the gorillas. Each one of our children is different, and we need to find the circumstances under which each child can flourish and under which each culture can flourish. So global intelligence in our era should mean the genius that can be created when every child on the planet is able to contribute his or her unique gifts to the global conversation, and when each culture can contribute its unique vision to the tapestry of our species. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote from Daniel Wildcat, who wrote a book called Power and Place, along with Vine Deloria. And he says, even a cursory examination of the numerous problems facing modern technological societies and the failure of modern education systems to find solutions to those problems, which are essentially moral and ethical in their character, suggests that something is fundamentally amiss in the dominant education systems of the United States. The conflict between Western science and religion and the inability of the vast majority of Western thinkers to find a common ground or consistent intellectual framework speak directly to the central problem with Western metaphysics, the failure to produce a coherent worldview encompassing the processes of the world and how we humans find meaning in those processes. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Carol. This has been lovely, and we have a lot of food, I can't even talk, speaking about being tired, we have a lot to chew on with this. I'm wondering, Steve had to run for a second to the conference lounge. I'm wondering if we can take a few questions if you want to do that. I think we can go over, but I'm going to stop recording if that's okay, because I want to make sure that we stop recording by 8, but I think we can stay here and talk. The problem is there are other sessions after this, so if somebody wants to leave and go to another session, that's fine. But I think what Carol said was amazing, and I think you might want to take a few minutes. We want to take a few minutes to question. Is that okay with you, Carol?
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'm going to stop recording right now, and then if you would like to ask Carol a question, raise your hand over by the participants window. You can raise your hand, and I'll call on you in a second. Oh,